As Brock and the remaining 5 men shot their way to the exit, Quincy was able to wound Brock in his leg. One of his men helped him out while the others fired back at the team. As Maclin and Phee hurried over to assist Quincy, they saw Burns 10 feet away, holding Skia and applying pressure to the nickel-sized hole in his neck, doing his best to stanch the heavy bleeding. "Don't worry about us, I got him. Go get Brock," Burns yelled. As soon as Maclin, Phee, and Quincy approached the open door, bullets pelted the wood at the entryway. Just before she retreated, she was able to see Brock being led off by 2 of his men, while the other 3 had taken up position, one behind a combine harvester and the other 2 behind a giant oak. Maclin and Quincy ended up on one side of the door, as Phee leaned on the other side.
3 shooters. They're trying to keep us pinned here to buy Brock some time,
Maclin said. Quincy looked at Phee and asked, "You or me?" "You." Quincy reloaded the Smith & Wesson .380 and bolted in the direction of the front door. Phee randomly fired outside the side entrance to keep the shooters engaged. 3 of his bullets ripped chunks of bark from the giant oak that had, unbeknownst to him, played its part in Shaka's death. When Maclin peeked through the doorway, Brock's men immediately returned fire, one bullet exploding splinters just an inch from her head. She nodded toward Phee at the near miss, then listened for the radio, her chest heaving from the adrenaline burst of having just cheated death. There was a second of quiet and an untruthful peace. The sound of Quincy keying the radio twice crackled in the still air. Maclin looked at Phee, then fired a few shots. They both saw one of the men go down, the center of his chest blooming red. The green grass beneath him was now soaked in blood. Phee and Maclin reloaded, then alternated firing, but the men were strategically positioned behind their cover. Phee bolted through the door, firing all the while in an attempt to draw the 2 shooters out more. As soon as the men took the bait and exposed themselves, Quincy came around the corner of the church and blindsided them. 2 clean shots, 2 clean kills. The trio took off immediately in pursuit of Brock and his 2 remaining guards. They split up when they came around the corner of a barn. Quincy went left, Phee went right, and Maclin headed straight to the cellar door egress. She cautiously descended the stairs, gun first. The tunnel was dank and reeked of damp fertilizer. As Maclin reached the bottom of the stairs, she could just make out in the darkness the silhouettes of Brock and his men 10 yards ahead, racing toward a bunker door. She keyed her radio as she ran.
"I've got eyes on Brock in an underground tunnel. Follow the cellar doors."
As Maclin chased after her prey, she was momentarily blinded by the stinging sweat that burned her eyes. The back of her throat felt like the Sahara and her calf muscles started cramping. She didn't know if it was the heat or the exertion, but her running woke Ivan. He stirred with a roar. She thought he couldn't have come at a more inconvenient time. He reminded her once again that her body still belonged to him. There was a shooting pain that started in her groin area and quickly made its way up to her solar plexus. Ivan set her lungs on fire. Maclin slowed, but never stopped. She refused to let anything prevent her from catching Brock, including her temperamental cancer or even the inconvenience of death. Maclin fired down the narrow passageway at will, trying to prevent the trio from reaching the safety of the bunker door and the potentially dangerous possibilities that existed on the other side. The man pulling up the rear went down, and the final guard who was supporting Brock took a hit in his side. He limped forward, ushering Brock into the bunker. As Maclin started gaining on them, Brock pushed the man backward, attempting to close the door on him. "Alice, what are you?" were the final words he uttered, as Maclin unloaded her clip into him, blowing him forward just enough for his arm to fall in the door's path, preventing it from closing. While Brock was trying to kick the arm free, Maclin extended both her hands, running with everything she had left full force into the closing door, knocking him backward in the process. The 6-inch thick steel door knocked the wind out of her. She felt her right wrist snap as she crumpled to the ground with a broken hand. She was left dizzy from the pain, but quickly sobered once she realized Brock wasn't on the ground in front of her. She forced herself up, her wounded wing dangling by her side. She pulled out her second gun from her left hand and walked deeper into the bunker, passing a dozen drums of the deadly gas compound Zyklon B. As she came around a corner, she was able to see how huge the bunker really was. The space was easily 40 feet wide and 60 long, with a narrow tunnel at the end that led to a dark unknown. It was heavily stocked with blankets and cots, first aid kits, sleeping bags, food rations, stacks of bottled water, and military-grade weapons. It could have easily accommodated 30 people for at least a month. As she moved even deeper into the makeshift room, she heard the heavy steel door slam shut behind her. She pivoted and pointed her gun in its direction. Since she wasn't a southpaw, it didn't feel as natural as it did in her right hand. The metal felt a little heavier and seemed to drift a centimeter or two from her aim. There was a shadow sneaking just around the corner of barrels getting closer to her. Maclin's trigger finger started slowly pressing against the metal stem. Just as a body came into view and she was about to squeeze, she recognized Ellis Brock's son. Although she kept her gun pointed on him, she relaxed her grip ever so slightly. When she heard movement behind her and turned her head, the split-second distraction allowed the boy the advantage of raising the gun that he had resting by his side. When she glanced back at him, his eyes were cold, and she saw the barrel of a 9mm staring back at her. The boy fired twice, hitting Maclin both times. The first bullet tore through her shoulder, while the second hit her center mass. Even though the full impact of the body shot was lessened by the chest plate of her Kevlar, her body still felt like she'd been hit with Fee's sledgehammer. She had never felt such excruciation. Not even Ivan's worst blow could compare. She dropped her gun as she fell backward. First came the pain. Then she was swallowed whole into darkness. She wasn't sure how long she'd been out. But when she came to, she saw Ellis Brock and his son looking down on her. Her head was uncomfortably propped against the bunker's stone wall, and the upper part of her arm was covered with her blood. The senior Brock was sitting on a crate while tying gauze around his leg to stop it from bleeding. There was an AR-15 assault rifle by his side. The boy knelt down close to Maclin's face, studying her as if she were an insect in a jar. He listened as his father spoke to her. "It's a good thing for all of us that you were wearing a vest. We wouldn't want you dying too quickly. So, did you really think that you were capable of killing me? You know, that's the problem with deluding yourself that you're the chosen ones. That inevitable moment when life reveals that you and the rest of your people are nothing more than self-entitled parasites. You were born from weakness, and that's how you deserve to die. Isn't that right, son?" Ellis Brock Jr. jumped in on cue, finishing his father's thoughts. "Annihilation is the fate of the wicked and the weak. Hitler understood that. Exterminating you is for the better of the whole. You're a malignancy, just like the niggers and border rats. We were born from power. That's how we made this country great once and how we'll make it even better than it was. Your Torah doesn't make exceptions for killing, isn't that right? Fortunately, the Bible is a little more flexible. You can never defeat us because we have God on our side and we're willing to do whatever it takes." Maclin no longer had questions regarding whether the boy was his father's puppet or if he was, in fact, a full-fledged hate-monger. As she looked in his eyes, she saw him for who and what he really was. She saw the vicious ownership. He was hate personified. She saw the old, warped soul, deep beneath the youth in his eyes. It had been there all along. She had just been too optimistic to see it. Ellis Brock Sr. spoke to his son. "A man's first kill is the most important one, because that's the one that defines him. Here, take my gun. Put her down the right way. Aim for the stomach. Let her bleed out slow and hard." When the boy tucked his handgun in his waistband and moved to retrieve his father's AR-15, Maclin's limp arm instinctively dropped to the side of her hip, brushing across her radio only to land on an empty holster. When he crossed back to her and toyed with her by pointing the nozzle of the weapon at her, she stared back at him with neither rebellion nor fear. She was still. Everything about her was minimal. Her movement, her breathing, even her thoughts. There was simply nothing left save resignation. The only good thing about Ivan was that he had already prepared her for her end. He filled her head with constant thoughts of death. Whether it was the cancer or even the probability of her not surviving the raid, she knew death was coming for her. She just never imagined it would be at the hands of the sad-looking boy with ocean blue eyes. After he finished wrapping his injury, Ellis Brock Sr. stood gingerly on his wounded leg. "We gotta take the tunnel. That door won't hold them out forever. When we make it out, there are plenty of people who will hide us. Go ahead. Put the muzzle underneath her vest and just shoot," Ellis Brock commanded. The boy poked her in her broken wrist with the tip of his rifle. "I'm not sure if it's any consolation to you, but at least you'll be credited with killing my father. I'm sure that will make you some kind of hero." Ellis Brock limped over to his son. "What the hell are you talking about? I told you just aim and—" His sentence was interrupted as his son suddenly turned and shot him. The sound made Maclin jump. Brock didn't fall right away. He teetered for a few seconds as though he was much too confused to die. He pawed at his wound helplessly, trying to stop the bleeding. When he finally went down, he landed on his back. Maclin could hear his lungs collapsing when the sound of his breathing became a high-pitched hiss similar to a punctured tire. Brock Jr. leaned the rifle against a crate as he moved closer to his father and knelt beside him. Maclin saw Ellis Brock struggling to speak. The best he could do was squeeze out the word, "Why?" The younger Brock answered him very matter-of-factly. "If we really are going to win this war, there isn't room for people like you. Not when you put your own ego and greed before the cause. What kind of man steals from his own people? You're a weak leader. I'll be better." He removed the handgun from his waistband, pointed it at his father's heart, and pulled the trigger. The bunker was silent. Ellis Brock Jr. stood over his father for a minute or two. Maclin assumed it was the closest thing to mourning that he had to offer. Even though she tried for movement, her body still didn't work. It hurt too much for any meaningful function. Her sternum was severely bruised, and there was most certainly a broken rib or two. When the boy came over and sat on the ground in front of her, Maclin thought he looked instantly older. There was a hollowness to him, more burden in his eyes than when she'd first met him. He'd played her, and played her well. What she had mistaken for youth was cunning. What she had mistaken for innocence was in fact evil. He now looked every bit the part of the boy who would be king. Phee was right. Hitler, too, was once a child. When he spoke, even the timbre of his voice was slightly different. "Now you know what I meant when I said my father was a dinosaur who didn't know he was extinct. I've been waiting for the right moment for a while now. Killing him was a lot easier than I thought, because the truth is, I love the cause much more than I ever loved him. His old-school ways of doing things are counterproductive. I told him that trying to create this whole race war thing was a mistake. He was too simple-minded to see that ultimately all it would do was demonize us and sanctify our enemies. You know how we take this country back? Not under the cover of darkness, but by hiding in plain sight. With education, high positions in finance and law enforcement. Not by lynching niggers and gassing Jews for entertainment, but by controlling the government and judicial system. When we control the law and the money, just like Hitler, we'll certainly control the people. We'll no longer have to worry about the Jewish problem or the black problem or the immigrants. I'm 13 years old. By the time I'm 25 or even 30, this country will be ours again.
Sounds like you've thought of everything,
Maclin said. That's because I have. Maclin smiled.
What about Niceburn?
Brock Jr. looked a bit bemused. What the hell is that?
It's the communications and data system for law enforcement throughout the state of New York.
As he looked at her even more confused, she made a small hand gesture toward the radio on her hip.
Our radios. Certain channels allow me to communicate with my partners on site. But if I switch to the base channel, then not only are we heard by over 30,000 cops statewide, but it goes through central dispatch and is automatically recorded.
You're making that up.
Am I?
The boy stared at her, searching her eyes for even the slightest hint of a bluff. Yes, you are, he concluded. Maclin remained calm.
Dispatch, would you please play back a part of our conversation?
Nothing came back but silence as the two of them continued staring at each other. The boy raised his 9 and pointed it at Maclin's forehead. Nice try. As his index finger found the trigger, Maclin's radio squawked. Brock Jr. heard a staticky playback of his own voice. Killing him was a lot easier than I thought, because the truth is, I love the cause much more than I ever loved him. His old-school ways of doing things are counterproductive.
Thank you, Dispatch.
Maclin interrupted. He kept the gun pointed at her, but was inoperative by the revelation. Gone were the confidence and the hubris of youth. She could see his mind racing as though he was searching for a possible spin on his admission. Maclin saw his fear turn to anger at the realization that he had been outsmarted by her. She didn't break her stare.
You look like you're trying to figure out whether there is possibly an angle for you to try and play. I gotta be straight with you. There is no angle to play. So now, your next move is whether or not you add killing a federal agent to your list. May or may not be a disappointment to you, but I'm not afraid to die. Especially not for this. Isn't that the point? That we're willing to die for what we believe in? I still end up better than you.
What are you talking about?
Because you only get to kill me once. Your death, on the other hand, will feel like an endless loop. You've been recorded confessing to a premeditated murder. You're clearly intelligent beyond your years and therefore able to fully comprehend the consequences of your actions. And because of that, you will definitely be tried and convicted as an adult and put away like one as well. New York still has the death penalty. You'll be the youngest to ever receive it. But I think that would be the least of your problems, because you'll actually never make it to the ball. You'll spend the rest of your days with hardened criminals, and don't think for a second that the white supremacists will protect you inside, because they'll think your father was a hero for what he attempted, and you, a traitor for killing him. All the Black and Latino men there will know who and what you are, and they'll remind you of that every chance they get. You wanted to be at the top of the food chain? You will be, trust me. A pretty white boy with golden hair and blue eyes. You won't be able to keep them away. The men that you've always feared and thought of as animals, and even new ones that look just like you, will show you firsthand just how base they're capable of being.
Maclin saw the first signs of defeat in his face. He blinked rapidly as though he were trying to keep horrible images and thoughts at bay. There was a slight quiver to his bottom lip. When she saw fear in the young boy's eyes, she pressed on even more.
They get to take everything that you ever thought you were. Your body first and foremost, but also your mind, and whatever you claim as a soul. Every time they come for you, they'll take parts of you, things you never get back. You might not believe it now, but you'll think of this conversation every time you're violated. That's how I win. It's also how you die. A little bit each day, until there's nothing left of you. So one night when you know they're coming for you, coming for their sport, and you just can't take it anymore of what the animals will do to you, that's when they find you hanging in your cell, dead before you've even made it to the age of 14. So whatever you want to do to me, I'm ultimately fine with, because I get to die with the satisfaction that, unlike you and your father, I go out on my terms, which is a fate far greater than yours, because I know what's waiting for you on the other side of these walls.
The boy's face was wet. Tear after tear ran down his cheeks as his body shook in small convulsions. The handgun that he pointed in her face trembled incessantly. If he was expecting fear from her, she gave him calm instead. She stared back at him, seemingly undaunted by the threat of death. He lowered his gun and placed the muzzle of it between the bottom of her vest and the top of her navel. It was then that he shot her, once in the gut. Through his tears, he warned her. You get to die slow. Not on your terms, mine. You don't win. None of you will ever win, because we'll keep coming. One dies, 20 rise. He put the gun in his mouth and pulled the trigger. Maclin couldn't feel anything. At best, she could only suck in half-breaths. She could see her fingers, hands, legs, and feet. She could see her bloody abdomen and the red pool beneath her, but she couldn't feel anything. Not even the pain of her injuries. She would have welcomed it, because it would have been something. The aching and agony would have at least been evidence of her body still in negotiations with life. She would have even welcomed Ivan, because no matter how cruel and overwhelming he was at times, he always reminded her that she was still alive. Instead, all she was left with was the numbness from head to toe. The only thing worse than pain was the nothingness. When a silent shadow fell across her face and blocked her drooping eyes from the light, she knew she wasn't alone. She knew that death was there beside her. Chapter 42. There was no parting of clouds or luminous light shining the path to heaven. There were no cauldrons of fire or stench and torments of hell. There was only the in-between, the vast acreage of a human way station. It was higher than earth and lower than sky, an infinite valley of unanswered questions and a bottomless ocean teeming with regrets. There were memories taller than redwoods, all yearning for recognition and to be laid claim to. Precious moments, now illuminated even more through the prism of hindsight. Everything was presented in snippets, 3D images of tiny extractions of an entire life. They were all the highlights: mother, father, brothers, childhood, adolescence, and adulthood. Schools, followed by the academy, followed by the meritorious ascension of an honorable career. The men who had impacted her life the most: Willington, Loescher, Quincy, and Phee. 2 were lovers who loved her, and 2 were partners who adopted her into their tribe. There was, of course, Ivan and the sentence of her cancer. There was the heartbreak of miscarrying a child and the healing joy of the uncanny bond she instantly felt with Fee's daughter, Dolicia. Her life, if weighed on a balance, tilted much more in favor of the triumphs than tragedies. Her love measured far more heavily than her hate. Her optimism registered more substantially than her despair. By all meaningful standards, her life mattered. When she opened her eyes, Phee and Quincy were there by her side. She was able to make out from the cast on her hand, along with the tubes and wires connected to her and a host of machines, that she was in a hospital. The partners stood on both sides of her bed. They were unshaven and there was blood, more than likely hers, on their clothes. She was groggy. It took a minute for her to be able to speak, and even then it was a weak whisper.
Did we?
Yeah. We got 'em all, Phee interrupted. Bobby Skia? Quincy hesitated. He didn't make it. As Maclin thought about Skia, tears immediately ran down the sides of her face. He continued, Burns has been with the family for the last 2 days. When Maclin looked at him oddly, Quincy clarified. You've been in and out for 2 days, mostly out. It was real touch and go, both during and after the surgery, but the doctors say you'll recover from your injuries. Phee joined in. We airlifted you back to Manhattan. Quincy and I stayed because, well, we wanted to be here when you pulled through. Losha's making sure you get the best that everybody has to offer. You're getting the full VIP treatment. The head of the FBI, the mayor, chief of police, everyone's been here to check on you. Maclin saw Quincy and Phee share a look and immediately felt that there was something they weren't telling her. She first saw it in the stealthy glances they exchanged and then heard the awkwardness in Fee's voice. Listen, Janet, when we brought you in, we overheard Losha tell the surgeon about the cancer. He assumed we already knew. I'm so sorry. Quincy and I thought whatever was wrong might be more serious than you implied, but had no idea how bad it really was. The day that you came to my house for lunch, before all the madness started, was that what you were coming to tell us? Maclin nodded her head. Quincy held her hand as he spoke. Look, I know there are people here much smarter than me when it comes to this kind of stuff, but I'll tell any one of the experts that they don't know you, Janet. Not like we do. I doubt that they've ever met a warrior like you. Look, it should go without saying, but any fight you show up to, Phee and I got your back. Phee grabbed her other hand. You fight, we fight. Like I told you once before, you don't get to break up the band that easily. Maclin smiled as she looked at Quincy and Phee. She saw more clearly the blood on their rumpled clothes. Their eyes were heavy with fatigue. She saw the toll that the case had taken, the mourning of fallen comrades, as well as the singe of hate that no matter how hard they tried to shake, would forever shadow them. She saw the rubble left in their lives. They still wore her blood on their clothes because they hadn't left her side for 2 days. She was moved beyond measure that they had put their own lives and loved ones on hold until they were certain that she had come back to them. Phee started laughing. By the way, I've got a good one for you. Spider told me that Ezra and his father invited him to Shabbat when he's up to it.
You're kidding.
She muttered. Maclin looked at him incredulously.
So what did Spider say?
He'd go only if Ezra went up to Harlem first. Who knows? Maybe a kosher soul food restaurant is in their future. Each time Maclin attempted to laugh, she ended up wincing from her stomach wound. Fee's phone vibrated. Oh, it's Brenda. I need to check in with her and the little one. I'll just be a minute. I'll tell one of the nurses to let Losha know you're awake. By the way, somehow we'd lost the $500,000 that was confiscated from Brock's safety deposit box. The good news, though, is that Shaka's wife and daughter will be taken care of.
So much for plausible deniability.
Maclin smiled.
Somebody once told me that everything that is right isn't always legal, and everything that's legal isn't always right.
I'm glad you're back, Janet. Phee headed out the door. As he left, Quincy patted the back of Maclin's hand. So Losha's been running up here in between patients every half hour to check on you. He's a good man.
I know he is.
And anybody can see that he's heart over head in love with you. He's the kind of man you want to have in your corner, Janet. He's like Phee and me. He'll always have your back. And, hey, listen, just a heads up. The two of them have already talked it through, and as soon as they let you out of here, you're going to be staying at Phee's guest house so we can all keep an eye on you. Phee told Losha he can come out and stay with you as much as the two of you want. Do yourself a favor. Don't try to protest, because it's non-negotiable.
I thought everything in life was negotiable.
Quincy smiled. Not when it comes to family. He pulled up a nearby chair and sat down. His weariness was obvious as it was instantaneous. The more Maclin stared at him, the more he seemed to melt into the chair.
You know you look like shit, right?
She joked. Well, considering that's how I feel, I guess that makes sense. Maclin looked at him, her partner, her brother, her co-protector.
I'm sorry that you and Phee didn't hear it from me. I owed the two of you that much. I just couldn't bring myself to...
Janet, stop. You didn't owe us.
It's the only time I've ever not told the two of you the truth, and I hated every second of how it felt.
Trust me, we both get it. This is not about us right now. It's about you. What you're going through and what you need to make it through. It's not always easy sharing bad things with people you care for most.
Well, I just never want to feel like I'm not being 100% straight with you or Phee. The three of us have been through too much together for anything less.
Quincy didn't respond. He just sat in his chair and looked at the wall. He was quiet and even looked a bit distracted. She could tell from his silence that for some reason she had lost him. Maclin didn't know why the conversation had wilted. The room suddenly felt segregated. There was his side and her side. Even though they were less than 3 feet apart, there was the narrowest of valleys that divided them. Quincy was often a tough read. Unlike Phee, who was incapable of biting his tongue, Quincy was more likely to suppress how he felt. Maclin let it go. Whatever it was, she knew he'd come back when he was ready. Losha entered the room a few seconds ahead of Phee. He was winded just enough to let her know he had come running when he got the news she was awake. Whether he had been in the middle of rounds in a consultation or otherwise engaged with patients or colleagues, his presence reminded her that she was his priority. She hadn't seen him in his scrubs and lab coat since first meeting him after she was admitted into the ER 2 years prior. Her first thought of him then was that he certainly looked the role of the indomitable doctor. But now, as he came through the door, she saw something else in his eyes. It was the bundle of fear, relief, and hope. When Quincy had mentioned earlier that her surgery was touch and go for a minute, it was a bit of an understatement. Losha was the one who told her that she had died, that for 23 seconds her heart had stopped and she had flatlined. Her mind was a field of questions. If it was hate that had killed her, then was it within the realm of possibility that it was love that brought her back? She hadn't necessarily cheated death, it was merely a postponement. Even that in and of itself was a victory. It was because she chose to embrace it that way. The 3 men in the room, 1 a lover and 2 her brothers, were both her family and her army because they chose to be. Unlike the parameters of the inherited bonds that they were born into, the 3 men had chosen her and she in return chose them. As she looked at the nucleus of her tribe, she remembered her mother telling her as a child that ultimately life came down to choices. Maybe not everything, but certainly the things that mattered. Things like love, God, and hate. Not God of the skies, although that too was a choice, but more specifically, God of the heart. She knew that Ivan had more pain in store for her, that there would be miserable days ahead, and the only fortitude that she would have to fight him was finding the light, even in the shadows of doubt and adversity. She thought about how life had often dealt her what she saw as a losing hand, and yet she had still survived, flourished even. Surrounded by people who believed in her so much that even in the face of death, they refused to give up on her. She thought about the times she doubted God, not his existence, but his compassion. When her mother died and again when her fiancé was murdered were the most difficult times. Those were the times that she too died, even if only in pieces. She blamed him for being mute when she needed his voice most. At the time she needed him nearest, he seemed to be the farthest away. She had no answers for the questions of why she hadn't heard him in years but could hear him so clearly now. She heard him when he told her that there were still sunrises left to warm her, gardens with daylilies to behold, conversations with him to be had. There were still debates and laughs and stories to be shared with Quincy and Phee. Time left to marvel at the preternatural connection that she had with an angel named Delicia, whose eyes lit up rooms and hearts with very little effort. He told her that despite the blows that life and Ivan had dealt, there was still enough magic left in her to brighten the eyes of an angel. He told her of the joy to be found in the unconditional surrendering of her heart to a man who truly loved her. Maybe he had spoken to her long ago, but because she was so smothered in bitterness and self-pity, she was either unable or out of anger chose not to hear him. The things he told her now were the weapons in her arsenal she had on the days that Ivan threatened to undo her. She completely trusted that she had what was most needed. If the things she learned as a child were true, that life was ultimately about choices, then Maclin was well armed with the mother of them all, faith. Epilogue. Maclin woke before dawn. She took her meds and then said a morning prayer. It was a new ritual she'd started in the week since she'd been discharged from the hospital. Losher was sleeping soundly beside her. She moved quietly, trying not to disturb him, since he hadn't gotten to bed until after 1:30 a.m. following being on call for 48 hours straight. She wanted him to have the peace of a lazy Saturday. He had been staying with her in Fee's guest house as much as he could. She missed him on the nights that he had to stay at the hospital. Like her prayers, he too had become a welcome ritual. She eased herself to the side of the bed, her stomach still tender from her wound, her hand still in a cast. She reached for her phone on the nightstand. Even though there were several emails, she scrolled past them to find the one she was looking for. It was from Rabbi Pearl. Each day he sent her a different passage from either the Torah or the Talmud, as well as secular words of wisdom and inspiration. Do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. Do justly now. Love mercy now. Walk humbly now. You are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it. She slipped on a pair of shorts and Losher's favorite Just Do It t-shirt and slowly tipped out of the room to go catch the sunrise. She walked gingerly, slightly bent at the waist. Although it took more effort to navigate around her physical limitations, part of her reward was that as soon as she made it outside, she was greeted by the scent of night rain that still lingered in the morning air. She could also smell the citrus from the potted fruit trees. It was the dawning of a beautiful day. The heat wave had broken, and the East Coast once again felt normal. When she made it to about 30 feet from the garden, she saw the lone silhouette of Quincy sitting in the gazebo. As she got closer, she spoke out.
You're the only person I know who requires less sleep and sanity than me.
Quincy rose and crossed to escort her the last few steps of her journey. I don't know if that's a compliment or a dig. She smiled at him in the dim light.
That was the desired effect.
I was just beginning to wonder whether or not you were going to make it this morning.
Wouldn't miss it for the world.
How are you feeling? He sat her down.
Not bad, all things considered. Loescher got me into a new trial program over at Sloan Kettering that's gotten pretty decent results with some of their stage 4 patients. I start on Monday. Who knows?
Never underestimate how far a little hope can carry you.
Even though I told Director Tuttle everything that's going on with me, for some reason he and the president still don't want to pull the plug on naming me general counsel.
Maybe it's because none of us are willing to give up on you, Janet. There were stretches of conversation, followed by swaths of silence. Maclin felt at times that Quincy wanted to say more than he allowed himself. They stayed in the garden longer than they ever had. The morning air was comfortably cool, a soft breeze swirled around them. It was the same gentle gust that carried the sounds from the kitchen that had escaped through an open window and floated in their direction. They heard the clatter of pots and pans and the familiar pitch of a young girl's laughter. Maclin smiled.
Sounds like a certain little angel is up.
Brenda told Elena that every morning as soon as Delicia wakes up, she asks for you. I think the two of you were related to each other somehow in another life, Quincy joked. Although she smiled, she took what he said more seriously than he intended. What if it were possible? What if her previous notions of spirituality were all wrong? Maybe contrary to what she had believed all her life, she and everyone else weren't just humans having spiritual experiences, but rather spirits having human experiences. Maybe life was a mysterious continuum, one that bent and made allowances for past encounters and the intersecting of souls. She no longer stood immovable on her lifelong absolutes.
For what it's worth, I think you and Elena should stop just talking about having kids and start actually having them.
Maclin blurted out. Wow, whoa, where did that come from?
I was thinking about Delicia and how when she walks into a room, she lights it up. I know what being on the job can do to us. Dealing with all the ugliness and horrible things that we encounter, we get to see the worst of what people have to offer.
Yeah, but...
Let me finish. Quincy, I know you're scared to bring a child into this kind of world. I totally get it. But what if, ultimately, that's our best chance of really shifting the balances? At the end of the day, isn't that what we're trying to do? One thing we know for certain is that the darkness will always come. Rabbi Pearl sent me something the other day that said, there is no source of darkness, only the absence of light. Quincy, we need more light in this world.
Quincy was quiet. She saw him processing. His expression was blank. Just as she thought she had lost him, he lowered his head and spoke. Maybe that's what I've lost faith in. I don't always know whether I can tell the difference between the darkness and the light. I used to, but I'm not so sure anymore. From the way he refused to look at her, she could feel that he was getting more and more uncomfortable. Maclin just sat there quietly, careful not to press him in any way. His energy changed and he started getting fidgety. He stood and walked to the edge of the gazebo to try to hide it from her. I need to tell you something in confidence, he said. I haven't even been able yet to talk about it with Phee, and it's killing me. Like you said in the hospital, we've been through too much together to not be straight with each other. She had never seen Quincy like this, so conflicted, so unsure of himself. After a few seconds of silence, he finally spoke. The other morning when you came out and I told you I was working on something. She nodded. A buddy of mine who I went through the academy with is now running a homicide department out in Chicago. They caught a pretty bad case about a week ago. Then another one a couple of days later. He reached out to me because it looks like a copycat of the first case you and I ever worked together.
The Degler case?
Yeah. I went over every detail a few times. I compared the MO, and trust me, It's identical.
How could it be identical? We never publicly released the details of how the victims were killed.
I know.
So how's that possible?
What if Degler had an accomplice? A confidant who knew exactly how he was committing the murders? What if that accomplice decided to continue what Degler started? I need you to trust me on what I'm about to tell you, Janet. I'm pretty certain I know who it is. Actually, I'm positive.
Who do you think it is?
My brother Liam. Acknowledgements. Thanks to God first, always. No matter how long or difficult the journey, the seemingly impossible was made possible with the tireless aid and dedication of 3 women who proved to be game changers. Raquel Henderson, my agent, master strategist, and consummate cheerleader. You've made my dreams your dreams, and you've made it your mission to find new ways to bring them to fruition. Lavelle Levette, the baddest of badasses. I'm always amazed at how many different hats you wear and how you consistently make magic happen. Yona Deschamps, you came on board our team with the force of a tornado that impressively keeps moving us forward. I also want to thank my assistant Penny Wasserman for having my back and keeping the team moving with effortless precision, because it really does take a village to raise a book. I truly appreciate all of you ladies and the profound impact you've made on me. I would also like to thank Brian Luch. Throughout my career, I've worked with many talented technical advisors on TV and movie projects, but you have always been the creme de la creme. Your integrity as a cop and your knowledge of procedure and law enforcement has elevated me as well as every artist you've worked with. Your generosity in allowing me to pick your brain and authenticate my characters and story is simply priceless. I can't thank you enough. You do the badge, the public, and your father proud. Love you, brother. David Appel, from the day that Luch told me that he wanted to introduce me to one of the highest-ranking Jewish cops in Chicago, you've treated this book as though it were a part of you. On countless occasions, you've educated and guided me through specifics of Jewish culture and religion. The book is more grounded and credible simply because of you always having my back. Thanks for serving as honorary godfather to this story. Thanks to the readers of this series. Your support and inspiration truly means the world to those of us that have stories to tell. Thank you.
The end. We hope you have enjoyed this production of Laws of Annihilation by Eriq La Salle, narrated by Eriq La Salle and Leslie Cohen. Recorded books are available wherever audiobooks are sold. Thank you for listening to Recorded Books.